Hey everybody, welcome to the Morning Devo with Bowo. Super stoked to be with you this morning and in a new book of the Bible. If you can believe it, we're already past the book of Exodus and we are moving our way into Exodus. We're going to see some cool things in this book. I tell you, it's going to be a real different kind of book than what we've been in, and you're going to maybe learn a lot about kind of what the Bible, kind of what it's about from this book. This book really reveals a lot, shares a lot with us, kind of opens up our eyes to some different things. And but before I get into anything, I just want to give a shout out to you guys and say what's up, all my Devo friends and peeps. I love what Marsha says. Yo, what's up, Devo peeps? And she's ready for Exodus. So sorry I couldn't be in here yesterday. But I hope you guys had a good holiday, a good Monday, and it's good to be with you today. And I'm planning on being with you, Lord willing, throughout the whole week, and we'll get into Exodus. So as we're going to see, Exodus is kind of narrows the narrative, if you will, of the Bible, really into the people or the descendants of Jacob. And remember that Jacob, his name was changed to Israel. So his descendants bear that name. His progeny will bear that name, if you will. And so now we see really this narrative get really, really focused in on this people. And so what we see in the Bible is sometimes these promises that were given early on in Genesis to all of humanity now being fulfilled in the lives of Israel. And so just as the Bible says, be fruitful and multiply, so we see now this fulfillment really taking place in the people of Israel, these people whom God has revealed himself to in mercy. And they have this interesting God that they follow, this invisible God. And so we see kind of the biblical narrative not being so much for all of humanity, but now it focuses in on this people group. And they're like I said, their progeny. Very, very interesting. And God revealing himself to any of us is an act of mercy. And I just want to remember that this morning in the Devo, is that whenever God is not obligated to me, he's not obligated to you. Any revelation of God, the true and living God, the Creator, is a wonderful act of mercy on the Creator's part. And am I thankful for that? You know, are you thankful for that? Is there a thanksgiving of just the realization, the understanding that you know God and that you can know God? And hopefully your heart wells up when you realize that you do have the capacity to know God and to understand God and to understand his revelation to us. So anyway, let's get into the text. It says, these are the names of the son of Israel, that is Jacob, who moved to Egypt with their father, each with his family. So here we see just a pickup right up of Genesis. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. In all, Jacob had 70 descendants in Egypt, including Joseph, who was already there. And in this time, Joseph and all of his brothers died, ending that entire generation. So we don't get kind of a blow by blow of everything that happened after Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. We kind of get a little bit of it, but that's all we get. It would be nice to get more, wouldn't it? and to get more understanding of how their relationship looked after Joseph moved all of his brothers and sisters and his dad into the land of Goshen. And what was that like? What, their kids playing together, what was that like? And all that. But we only get little snapshots, and sometimes that's how our brain works too, I think, is sometimes we just get snapshots of things of the past. If you remember your past, sometimes they don't come in giant chunks. Sometimes they just come in little screenshots, if you will, of little pictures that you remember. And but it tells us that generation passed away. And I think this is always something good to remember in a Devo, and that is our generation will pass away too. And then there will be our progeny that will be after us, and their progeny after them. And what will they do? What will they be? Who will they follow? Who will they serve? What will they be like? What decisions are they going to make? And this is something that I think a lot in our culture don't look at enough, and that is the importance of progeny. And what progeny does is it makes you realize that you are just one generation, and that's all you are. In Christ, the New Testament says we are a royal priesthood. We kind of are a royal group of people, kind of a royal generation, if you will. We have a special place in the kingdom as followers of Jesus Christ. But as human beings, we're just one generation, and that's all we are. And we have to remember that we will pass away, and we are. And I like how it says pass away. And the reason why is because we are literally passing away. And it's a very biblical idea. We are like a blade of grass that is up one day and gone the next, right? We are like a flower that buds one day and gone the next. But we will too pass, and then it will be the next in line. And like I kind of mentioned, our culture sometimes looks at children and they don't see children in a positive way. They see them as a burden and difficult. And boy, how times have changed and how things are different. And when I was young, I was like that, certainly, man. I thought, no way I'm going to have kids. I mean, what are you talking about? And had that attitude, as a young man. And, but there's so many lessons. There's so many things that children teach you. And I think one of the things they teach you is that your time's coming to an end. And every time you look at your kids, you look at them and you go, wow, they're kind of, younger than me. And they're, they think different than us. And they have their way and that kind of thing. And you realize that all you are is one generation. It's all you are. And in time, Joseph and his brothers, they died, ending that entire generation. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren. See, they were fruitful. And it says, in fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. This is very much like a fulfillment of that idea from back in the Garden of Eden. Be fruitful and multiply. You guys remember that, right? God told Adam and Eve that be fruitful and multiply. Well, here you see it kind of moving in the people of Israel. And so this is how the Bible gets very focused into this narrative, of the people of Israel and them receiving the promises, them holding fast to this revelation of God. And so they become powerful and filled the land. How powerful did they become? Well, it's interesting. When we think about it, we go, hey, think of populated places today. Think of India. Think of Africa. Think of China. And that's where the world lives. That's where actually the population of the world's at. The rest of the area of this planet Earth is lightly populated in comparison to those places. Those places have 1.6 plus billion people in those continents. So extremely large amounts of people. And therefore, they can become quite powerful just based on their population. So, you think of an economy that is, powerful like California. Well, California is a state that has a lot of people in it, right? And sometimes those lot of people can equal power. Definitely power potential. And sometimes we don't see things that way. We don't see population, an increase in population being power potential. Sometimes we see it as more like, oh, that gets in the way, blah, 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 blah. I want to do what I want to do. Da, 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 da. They're going to take my money. This whole thing. But, as a nation, there's a lot of power potential here in Israel. And they filled the land. So God created the land to be inhabited. We saw that all the way back in Genesis. And so now we see this verbiage that's really similar to the book of Genesis. And we really see Israel fulfilling this promise and this command of God, right? To be fruitful and multiply, fill the land. So it says, eventually a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. Hey, guess what? Why do you do what you do? Why do you do what you do? There's always going to be someone who's going to come into power who's not going to know who you are, not going to know about what you had done. And it's going to be in the past. It's going to be gone. Joseph's, all the amazing miracles, all the amazing visions that he received and interpreted by the power of God, all of it was forgotten. It was now in the past. It was now gone. And we too, all of our amazing deeds, all of our whatever we got going on for us, it'll all be gone. It'll all be done. But we know it's not for nothing. We know for those who are in Christ, what we do, we want to do in Christ. We want to do it with the motivation of wanting to glorify Christ, wanting to serve Him. And so it's not for nothing that we live our lives. Our lives are very important. But we must remember that as we grow older and as we pass away, things will change. Why? Because new people will become in power. So here we see it. The Egyptian king gets in power, and it says he knows nothing about Joseph and what he had done. Nothing about it. So, hey, guess what? We better do what we do unto the Lord and unto the Lord alone, right? And really just with that focus that we're serving God. Because there's going to come a time where people aren't going to know who you are, ain't going to remember what we've done or anything, or how we were used by God to change our world and change our culture, and for the future progeny. And I love that. Is my mind, is it for the future? Is it for the progeny that comes after us? Am I making decisions that will benefit that future, or am I not? So that's a good thing to think about this morning. Am I thinking about the future generation? And but do I live my life as if I'm living to glorify God today in the day to day? So something to think about for sure. So it says that he said to his people, look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. So this is what the Egyptians are saying. They outnumber us. Isn't that amazing? They've grown. They've had a lot of babies. And so what we know for certain is that God sent Joseph through suffering as a sending for salvation to the people, to his brothers, and it really is in the hope of an increase of fruitfulness, right? There was going to be a fruitfulness, a bearing of fruit in the wonderful faithfulness of Joseph. And that fruitfulness showed itself in this nation becoming powerful, fertile, fertile people, having a ton of babies. And the Egyptians are starting to freak out. And they're going, these people are really living large. They're up in Goshen. They're getting all the water, the nutrients. They're enjoying themselves. They really have nothing to do other than basically make babies. And make babies they are. And so, they become now potentially stronger than Egypt. Now, the ruling powers always change. Here we see the ruling power of Egypt changing. We see it in our day as well. Ruling powers come and go. And sometimes a ruler will come in and he'll do the exact opposite of what the last ruler has done. Can you guys think of an example of that? I'm sure you can. And now they say we must make plans to keep them from growing even more. If war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us, and they will escape from this country. So what really is the root of the government's decisions? What is the root of it? Well, it's what? Fear. Yeah, they're trying to, in a sense, safeguard their people, their own people. But really it comes from a fear, right? What if this happens? They're going to go against us. Isn't that amazing? That's what really runs a lot of government decisions, is incredible amounts of fear. What if this happens? What if that happens? We need to do this because what if that? Blah, blah, blah. Sometimes fear is running not just our own personal lives, but sometimes it's running a lot of what we call the big decisions of a nation. And sometimes the nation is just a macro. It's just the big picture of what's going on in the people's hearts. Were the Egyptians looking at the Hebrews at this time, Hebrews being the descendants of Israel, and were the Egyptians looking at them going, wow, there's so many of them. Gosh, I wonder, why are they in our nation? Why are they here? Were they starting to bicker? Were they starting to be complainers? Were they starting to be prejudiced people? Were the Egyptians making fun of the Hebrews? Or were the Hebrews making fun of the Egyptians? Was there like an ethnic battle that kind of was going on in the micro, in the small, just amongst the individuals? Because we see that in the big, in the macro, in the government, they were literally saying, "Hey, these people are so strong. If we go to war, they could potentially join the other side and fight against us." So they definitely saw them as a different group of people. The Hebrews as a different group of people. The Hebrews did not assimilate completely into Egypt and Egyptian culture. They really stayed a part of themselves, and they kept their ethnicity, if you will. And so this fear is dominating, and I don't want fear to dominate me. I really have to work on that always in my life. God help me when it comes to fear and decisions that are made out of fear. So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. Isn't that sad? So we see that the Egyptians make the Israelites their slaves. So they kind of force them. They do. They force them into slavery. Now, this is a lot different from the narrative from the end of Genesis, where there was a long famine in the land, and the Egyptians were coming to Joseph and literally selling themselves. They were saying, "Hey, use me, make me be a slave of the state, and I'll work for you guys, and you guys can help subsidize our food." In a sense, Joseph had what was kind of what we would think of as like a welfare system going on during that 7-year famine for the citizens of Egypt, where this is far different. This is where you have now a totalitarian government that is basically setting up a system where they are forcing individuals who do not want to be slaves, aren't needing to be slaves, meaning they don't need ultimately to put themselves in the servitude of the state, because they have an abundance. They're doing fine financially, but they are literally being coerced and forced to enter into a slave relationship with the state. And remember, the government's doing this to demonstrate their power over. Why? Because they fear them. They fear what they potentially could do if the Hebrews were to turn against the Egyptian government. So you can see how fear within that government structure really puts them, that fear in us forces us to act in ways where we want to dominate over other people. So pride comes into place, envy comes into place in our hearts, and we want to dominate over others. We would rather make them slaves to us than having them be free, because that's what fear does. Is fear moves into all these different areas of abuse that we see, whether it's on a large scale, a macro, like in government, or whether it's in a small scale in our own individual lives. So if you fear, sometimes you will go into very vicious forms of abuse in your life, where you will treat other people horribly. And all the while, you have a lot of fear that's in your heart. So a very, very vicious emotion that can run amok within us humans is this fear. And we see it dominating the Egyptian society right now. And so they make them slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. Oh, that's so sad, right? And, that sentence is just such a powerful one. They appointed brutal slave drivers. What were these people like? Reminds me of a song by Bob Marley, Slave Driver. But what were those slave drivers like? What was their hearts like? What was their minds like? How did the Egyptians get all the people, all the citizens of Egypt to go along with this? What was the propaganda machine of the day? That the Hebrews were going to turn on them? That they potentially could fight with the enemies and crush Egypt? Or was it something else? Was there another kind of propaganda that was going on? But notice now they appoint brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. There are things that are wearing us down that become crushing labor to us, right? And we're serving a brutal slave driver. Man. Marcia wrote, "Fear is a liar, still true." Yeah, it's good. Yeah, so sometimes we look at our lives and we go, hey, who is running my life? Who is my slave driver? And who is wearing me down? Who is, with crushing labor? It says they forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for the king. Right? They're working now for the king, for the king's things. It says, but the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread. Isn't that interesting? The more they come against them, the more the Israelites just continue to hunker down amongst themselves, and they still are intimate with one another, and they grow and they multiply. Isn't that beautiful that they still are intimate during difficult times? And this is important, but sometimes in difficult times, we tend to isolate. And I love how the Israelites stayed together and they developed an intimacy in their marriages. Obviously, they were intimate. They had children, but they kept in fellowship and closeness in relation. And that's important for us not to isolate ourselves, but to stay together with one another, even in difficult times. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy and made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields, and they were ruthless in all their demands. So we're going to see something called the Passover later on. You might have heard of the Passover Seder, where you eat bitter herbs. Well, here's why, is because their lives were made bitter. And so during the Passover supper, there is some bitter herbs there to remind everybody of the bitterness of forcing them to make these monuments, these buildings for the ruling power of the day. And it says they were ruthless in all their demands. They treated them horribly, and they were forced, and they were coerced. But yet they hunkered down, and they were together, and they stayed close to one another, and they grew, and they took care of their kids, and all the things that man, really helped them mentally. And what helps us mentally is to being with other people. And that's what people are talking about today, is what's really the repercussions of what's happened over the last couple years. And that's really been horrible. And, COVID, that's something that's important to talk about. But there's also a mental health issue that is being expressed too. And we're seeing a growing issue with some of the decisions that were made over the last 2 years and the repercussions of those decisions. It's important for us to be together. It's important for us to enjoy one another and to see one another and to express our need for prayer for one another and all that. Just isolation is never good. Now the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrews, to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and said, when you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live. But because their midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders. What a cool passage, right? Casey says, so good for my walk with Christ and for my faithfulness when I got out of my isolation and fear. There's no fear when God goes with us. That's right. So true. And so here you see these midwives being put in a situation where either they're going to obey the law of the land or they're going to obey God. And notice, because they feared God. So check this out. 200 years after Joseph, that's when this is going on, by the way. Over 200 years after Joseph, they feared God. And so that tells us that there has been a consistent education of the true and living God into this generation. And they thought, and when the government said, hey, this is what you need to do, you need to kill these kids, these boys, they said, no way. It doesn't matter who you are. You can't have us do something. We fear God. And taking a life of a baby was an absolute no-no because of their conscience with God. That was something they obviously believed, that life and death were in God's hands, and that it wasn't for them to take a life, not with their hands anyway. And they knew that much. That was already given to them in their education. It makes me think, what do we lack in today's education? What do we lack in today's education? Can we make the same decisions today? If a government tells us to kill, can we say, would we fear the Lord and say no? What would we do in that situation? These two Hebrew midwives feared God over human beings, over the ruling power. And that is a powerful testimony. What happens is, in a society when this is no longer the case? Interesting questions. So the king Egypt called for the midwives. "Why have you done this?" he demanded. "Why have you allowed the boys to live?" "The Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women," the midwives replied. "They are more vigorous and have their babies so quickly that we cannot get in there in time." So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. So these midwives are blessed because they literally stood up to the Pharaoh. It might seem interesting what they said, but regardless, they stood up to the ruling power. Very, very interesting, right? Very, very powerful. And notice it says God gave them families of their own. You get the idea that the Israelites are kind of tracking with really a life of serving God, and God being, in a sense, their government. And that they don't really need any other government because God's their government, and God's regulating them in their life, their hearts. They know not to murder. They know not to do those things because they're walking with God. They're fearing God. And so they don't need a government to tell them not to do things. They got God telling them not to do things. And that is a more powerful source of government, is God. And so it holds them in line, even greater, even better, right, than any government can, human government can. So then Pharaoh gave the orders to all his people, "Throw every newborn boy into the Nile River, but you may let the girls go." But Pharaoh hardens his heart and gives the order to all his people. When a government gets frustrated, it continues to push and to push and to push. And it gets all the people on their side and in the society, and continues now to really demonize the Hebrews. And really, like I said, I don't know what the propaganda was, but it was something so much so where Pharaoh's citizens tracked with Pharaoh and said, "Yeah, that's right. We need to throw out every newborn Hebrew boy. We need to throw him into the Nile." Could you imagine that? I mean, just wild, right? But that's what we have to be careful with as a society, what are we being told? Are we demonizing people? Are we looking at people with evil and hate in our heart? Is what we're being told is it creating more hate in us? Is that what's the result or the fruit of what the news or the propaganda of Pharaoh? Is it just that is the result and the fruit of what Pharaoh's saying and what his government's putting out? Is it really love? Is it really help? Is it really compassion? Is it really care? Is it really understanding? Is it any of that, or is it just hate? And we see there's a lot of hate going on. So if you see some parallels to our day, it's because nothing's new under the sun. And we will see parallels to our day. But notice the big thing is that God is with them. They look to God. They're fearing God. And this morning, that's what we want to do too, is look to God, fear the Lord, right? Fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom, the Bible says. So, hey, we've started Exodus, and chapter 1 is in the books. So I hope you guys have a good rest of the day. Enjoy it, remembering that we too are like the Hebrews, where we have this neat relationship with God. And that's what's governing our hearts and our lives, our mind. It's regulating everything in us, is this relationship we have with God. So you guys take care, and you guys have a great one, okay? Bye-bye.